And I'd like to thank, I guess the buzzword was CSS, we'll call it Coalition for Sensible Safeguards, and Center for Effective Government, and Center for Progressive Reform, CPR, for co-hosting this. Timing couldn't be more worse or better, depending on your perspective. Today in the Washington Post was the poultry rule discussion, or the lack of poultry rules. We also had the West Texas West Fertilizer fire and explosion. Each of these, lead me to sort of three reactions. A lot of you in this room have written about the specifics of each of those situations, but there seems to be three common threads, and one is the kind of fragmented regulatory scheme that exists. There's no one agency that has a total picture on these companies, and as a result, you have this one agency knows this, another agency knows this, and all these gaps that occur in between. The second kind of thing that is a huge theme that I saw was the problem of very minimal enforcement. Cost of doing business is you just weave in the penalty cost, or when penalties do come, you negotiate a deal and you reduce the penalty. And I think the third is probably the most shocking to me, is the problem that these emergency response plans, worst case scenarios, risk management plan, whatever you want to call them, they're inadequate. We only have to look back a few years to think of BP and the lack of quality in that plan. There's no one checking these plans, or if there is, it's minimal. On top of it, because the fragmented nature, you only get one piece. You don't get the total picture, as in the West case. So, we didn't just accidentally walk into this kind of weak regulatory framework or weak need enforcement structure. This is planned. This is something that was very coordinated, and companies threat to relocate. They use the virtual bribery of money in politics, whether it's campaign contributions or lobbying. And of course, the worst is the whole capture of not just the regulatory agencies, but government. It's a sad state of affairs. I'm reminded of a story, maybe apocryphal, about Albert Einstein, who was taking a train, and the conductor was coming along to pick up the tickets, and was recognized that it was Albert Einstein. Einstein was looking for his ticket, doing one of these things, and the conductor recognizes that Professor Einstein, it's okay, we don't need your ticket. And he's still searching and looking everywhere, and the conductor says, no, it's really okay. And then Einstein gets down on his hands and knees and looking under the chair for the ticket. The conductor says, really, it's okay. And finally Einstein says, it may be okay for you, but I need to find the ticket to know where I'm going. And I think all of us are in that situation today where we need to be figuring out where we are going. Professor Tom McGarity's book, Freedom to Harm, which I'll shamelessly promote. This is like buy your Jinsu knife. And you all have a form in front of you on where you can get it. Tom McGarity's book does a wonderful job of taking us backward in order to go forward and find where our ticket is. And actually all the panelists today will both be reflective and prospective, to look forward, look backward, and look forward. In the panelists, we have truly renowned expert players. Tom McGarity, many of you in this room know as a law professor at the University of Texas. I know him more from the notion of helping me in all the fights I was engaged in on the regulatory front, because he, along with, David Vladack earlier, you guys coined a lot of terms that I use, like taking from other worlds and applying in the administrative law area, paralysis by analysis, or ossification. And today we'll probably hear patch and repair as a new set of terms. And Tom has really been a leader for all of us in putting things down on paper and exposing what I'll call corruption. He will spend about 15 minutes running through his points of view. Then the rest of us on the panel will respond with about 5+ minutes or so. And we have David Hawkins, who will kick it off. David, remarkable. I mean, it's like a real treasure sitting next to me. This is a guy who, I've lived the fights with, going back in many years on these regulatory battles. David got to NRDC in 1971. I wasn't even born yet. Okay.
You weren't born again yet.
Yeah, I wasn't born again. But also, David brings a certain amount of expertise, having worked at EPA as an assistant administrator. And so he's had this inside-outside point of view, and it helps to inform a lot of the dialogue he'll bring today. We'll next hear Phil Barnett. If there's anyone who is more masterful at legislative matters and strategy, I can't imagine who it would be. Phil has been on the Hill 20 years or so and living through about every major fight dealing with consumer protections, regulatory protections, environmental protections, and has also taken time off from that experience to be at FDA for a short period. He is now working and has been for many years for Congressman Henry Waxman, a hero to everyone in this room. And he has the experience of being on the Hill when a lot of these fights have occurred. And then Caroline Smith DeWall, not only are we in her home right now, but
so to speak.
So to speak. No, the way you work, it's your home. Caroline also is a fellow traveler on all these kinds of issues. She runs food safety program here at CSPI. I don't think there's a single article, a single hearing, a single major event that deals with food safety where there's not a quote from Caroline. She is the respected authority in the area and has more knowledge than all of us probably dreamed to ever have around food safety. So that'll serve as the introductions. What I will do is, because we're a small enough group, after they're done, instead of just falling into a straight Q&A kind of model, I really want to turn this more into interactive. And so I may probe a question back at you all. And so be prepared. Stay awake. Okay? With that, I'm going to turn it over to the master, Tom McGarity.
Well, thank you very much, Gary, and I certainly want to give my thanks to the Bauman Foundation for bringing me here and putting this on. It's just a wonderful thing. I couldn't be more grateful. And for CSPI for hosting it. I teach a seminar, have been for over 10 years now, on food safety. And first thing I tell my class when they come in is that where you want to begin is with the CSPI website. And that's where they start. And they learn, I'm sure, much more from this, in this day and age where the students, that's what they do, right? Sometimes when you prefer, they'd be listening to your lectures. But that's a good place for them to be. So I wanted to thank you, too, for hosting this. The book, Freedom to Harm, is about a 35-year campaign by the business community, its allies, and conservative think tanks and the conservative media to roll back regulatory protections and common law rights to a late 19th century laissez-faire benchmark. That's the essence of the book right there, is about this 35-year campaign. The subtitle of the book speaks of the Laissez-Faire Revival, and that Laissez-Faire Revival was no accident. It really started at the end of the what I call the public interest era, the 1965 through 75, somewhere in that range, where we saw the public interest groups persuade Congress to enact the bedrock fundamental statutes of the environment and to some extent consumer protection as well. The business community was slow to react to it. One person who wasn't was an attorney in Richmond, a prominent attorney named Lewis Powell, who wrote a memorandum to his friend. He was a public education director of the United States Chamber of Commerce. The memo said we're getting creamed by the environmentalists out there, by Ralph Nader and the Consumerists said nothing less than the future of free enterprise is at stake here. We need to create a cadre of experts in academia and elsewhere who will take the free enterprise message to the public. And they should be publishing books, they should be publishing articles and magazines, pamphlets, and that sort of thing. 2 months later, he was appointed by President Nixon to the Supreme Court. 5 years after that, William Simon, who had been the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of the Treasury and the Energy Czar, prior to that, wrote a book called The Time for Truth, where he said that we need a counterintelligentsia. We need to give grants, and more grants so that they'll publish books, and more books. And several foundations, of course, Simon left to be the head of the John M. Olin Foundation for 15 or 20 years. Several foundations like the John M. Olin Foundation, Smith Richardson, Schiaffy, Koch brothers, Coors, created what I call an idea infrastructure. Think tanks, the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, that sort of thing, created the law and economics movement in the law schools in the United States, particularly the preeminent law schools. They created a Federalist Society that is in every law school in the country. And of course, the conservative think tanks. They also created an influence infrastructure, which saw a great expansion of the corporate lobbyists in Washington, D.C. Public relation firms springing up everywhere, grassroots, AstroTurf grassroots organizations like Citizens for a Sound Economy, and of course that conservative media, the Fox News, and that group of quite opinionated cable commentators. They launched then 3 major assaults on our federal regulatory programs. The idea infrastructure, fighting the air war, the influence infrastructure, fighting the ground war. The idea infrastructure to persuade the American public that government was bad for us, the influence infrastructure to persuade Congress and decision makers in the executive branch to roll back regulatory protections. The 3 assaults, the first one started really at the end of the Carter administration and lasted through the first 3 years of the Reagan administration. The first major executive order requiring centralized review and cost-benefit analysis was issued in the Carter administration. President Reagan topped that one, but Reagan also then put into place leaders of the agencies who were fundamentally opposed to the things that those agencies were doing, slashed the regulatory agency budgets, and ultimately went too far as the Gorsuch scandals flared up, and it really came to an end by 1983. The second assault started in 1994 with the contract for America, with America, and that's on America. The 104th Congress, I call the Gingrich Congress, again came as close as we've ever seen to really taking apart the fundamental bedrock statutes, so that we had serious amendments to the Clean Water Act. We had the Occupational Safety and Health Act that both passed the House. And we had omnibus regulatory reform legislation, really expanding on cost-benefit analysis, and even really putting in a super mandate so that all federal agencies writing major rules would be subject to a cost-benefit decision criteria, not just to do the analysis. That came to an end with the big fight over the environmental riders and the government shutting down twice. Then the third assault, of course, came with the inauguration of George W. Bush. He again put confirmed anti-regulators in charge of the agencies, cut back budgets again, and ultimately the outcome of all this was one, and this is the hopeful thing, the bedrock statutes weren't amended. They're still in place. A lot of them are aging, and they certainly could use updating. But the bedrock statutes survived because the American public wasn't going to put up with that. And people like Gary bringing in people in the 104th Congress to show the victims of some of the tragedies that come from the absence of regulation had a lot to do with that. But what did happen is that the agencies themselves were debilitated. There was greater freedom, and that's what companies wanted, economic freedom, greater freedom to innovate, grow the economy. But as I say in the book, this social bargain that we've been negotiating since the 19th century requires freedom, yes, but it requires responsibility and accountability too. Three things. And we lost responsibility, we lost accountability during this period of time. Hence, and I thought I was going to have to make this point when I wrote the prospectus for this book way back in 2005 or so when I was thinking about this book, a confluence of crises. I said we were going to have an accountability crisis. I thought I was going to have to prove that, but they just happened right around me as I was writing the book. The financial meltdown, the Upper Big Branch mine explosion, the Deepwater Horizon, just recall after recall after recall of contaminated spinach, contaminated peanuts, contaminated eggs, contaminated peppers. People couldn't trust the food they were eating. There were also less visible crises going on at the same time. Thousands of heart attacks caused by too hastily approved drugs in the Food and Drug Administration. The quiet desperation of a homeowner facing the consequences of an accelerating rate mortgage. And of course, the silent but steady increase in global temperatures and the rise of the oceans. So we have this confluence of crises. The stars are aligned for a major progressive move forward, a moment, a great Republican moment, if you will. That's with a small r. Like we had in the progressive era, the New Deal and the public interest era. We had a charismatic president elected in 2008. We had a president that had run on as an agent of change. So we might have expected a lot to happen in that period of time when we had Congress, the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress with even a veto-proof, not veto-proof, but filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. It didn't happen. What we got, well, first of all, without one can blame the administration for this, but understand that President Obama had something working against him that President Roosevelt, Franklin and Teddy, and President Johnson, and to some extent, you pushed forward, Nixon, didn't have to deal with, and that is these infrastructures, powerful infrastructures, the idea of infrastructure constantly beating on the government, the influence infrastructure there in place. It was just a different situation. That being said, he didn't seize the bully pulpit to move things forward. He wasn't committed to change. He appointed very good people at middle levels of the agencies, but the people he put in charge in the White House were not committed to progressive change. So what we got were patch and repair reforms. That is, reforms, we have a crisis, we have reforms aimed at the particular cause of that particular crisis without changing the underlying incentives of the business community in any of these areas. We got the Dodd-Frank Act. We got the Food Safety Modernization Act. All good things. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is a good thing. Many good requirements in the Food Safety Modernization Act, but all not changing the fundamentals of the relationship between business and government. Now, I take the position in the book that this is because President Obama is a mugwump. And I say that the mugwump party was a party that existed right after the Civil War. It was in reaction to the corruption of the Grant administration. It was a good government party. It was mostly East Coast businessmen, clerics, and academics. The image in the newspapers of the mugwumps was somebody sitting on a fence, because they were very much about deliberation and agreement and consensus building. And it was somebody with his mug on one side of the fence and his wump on the other side of the fence. But the term is an Algonquin Indian term for wise men. And the idea was, if you just put wise men from all sides of a dispute together and they deliberate and reason together, they will come up with the best solutions for the rest of us. I really think that captures Barack Obama fairly well. In any event, what happens, of course, is we have a fourth assault underway. And it started with the Tea Party movement that came out of the Citizens for a Sound Economy, the Americans for Prosperity, Freedom Works. The Tea Party idea existed 2 years before the rant on CNBC. Freedom Works already had that ready to go. It literally went onto its website the afternoon after that rant. They knew what they were doing. They had this planned. But the idea here was something that should have never happened, and that is they turned public resentment, and there's intense public resentment against Wall Street, as we saw AIG people taking home huge bonuses and going for partying in Arizona, and ordinary folks getting stuck with the bill. Tremendous resentment against Wall Street. And that's what the Tea Party seized on and turned it against government. Well, it's because the government screwed up. And it's phenomenal that happened, but we let it happen. So what do? Well, we need to strike a new balance. We need to get more accountability, more responsibility back in the balance. The one thing that I suggest in the book is, I don't think anyone disagrees with this, we need a progressive narrative, a new progressive narrative. And we need to be talking about things like, of course, freedom is the business community's narrative, right? And they don't talk much about responsibility or accountability. Well, we should be talking about corporate responsibility, corporate accountability. Not corporate responsibility the way the corporations talk about corporate responsibility, which is, oh, here's all the green things we're doing for the environment that we should get patted on the back for. But serious responsibility that you mind the rules of the game. And the other thing I think we could seize on is security. And that people want to feel like somebody's looking out for them. Somebody's looking out for their good. And I think people don't get that sense, and they don't think the government's capable of doing that. We need to restore some trust in the capacity of government to do that. I have other reforms that, and broadly, because I'm out of time, but I'll just put on the table because this is what I think we want our discussion to be about. Changing those incentives. There are ways to change incentives. There's one is taxes, but not taxes like income taxes, but taxes on conduct that you don't want to encourage, that you want to discourage. We can't talk about taxes because the right wing has simply removed that from our lexicon. Well, we need to bring it back, and we probably should think of some other word than taxes. We can call it fees. We can call it paying your way. We can use words like that, but putting negative consequences that hit the pocketbook of business organizations, reducing moral hazard on the part of business organizations, stronger enforcement. The New Source Review, I've just finished an article on the New Source Review process that started in 1999 in the Clinton administration, but continued on even though the Bush administration didn't want to do it. But it was already in the pipeline. And we got great improvements, at least promised in consent decrees, which are enforceable, from these power plants as a result of that New Source Review. Ways to shift the burden of proof onto the industry, the people who are profiting from it. Porthole regimes, I call them, like the Food and Drug Administration's regimes. And of course, we need to build a progressive idea infrastructure. We've never had one. We're working on it. The Center for Progressive Reform was part of that. I think the Center for American Progress is part of that. But we need a lot more because we're still losing the air war in a very, very big way. I'll stop there because I want to hear what other people have to say as well.
Great, thanks.
Sure.
Let's turn to David Hawkins from NRDC.
Well, thank you. It's a real treat for me to be here with Tom and other friends on the panel and in the audience to talk about a really important topic that we've all been working on. The book is a great book. It's going to be a huge resource for scholars, for people who want to understand how the system is working and isn't working. I think Tom in the book does some truly great services. First, he documents how important government protections are and the huge accomplishments of government protections over the last several decades. Perhaps even more importantly, he documents how the cabal of industrial lobbies, their lawyers and right-wing ideologues have erected this structure that has been all too effective in blocking additional progress. These are really important things. I hope that every student at the Kennedy School of Government is required to read
Me
this.
too.
We need people who are coming out of these institutions that are informed about how things actually work, so they don't come in and just say, well, who could be against cost-benefit analysis? I thought I'd take a couple of minutes and just mention a few episodes as I experienced them, because I've had the privilege of living through a lot of what Tom documents. And I started in Washington as a young lawyer right out of law school in 1970, which is the year that the Clean Air Act amendments were enacted into law. And boy, those were the golden days. EPA came into effect December 31st, 1970. By April 30th of 1971, 119 days later, EPA had not only proposed, it had put in the Federal Register in final adopted form the first set of health protection standards under the Clean Air Act. That's a world record.
One page in the Federal Register.
Yeah, yes. It is an example of what you can do if you don't have this obstructionist red tape. The reason that happened is the business community wasn't organized at the time. It didn't take very long for the pushback to start occurring. The Nixon administration established something called the Quality of Life Review, which was an informal opportunity for Haldeman and Ehrlichman to basically sit on regulations that somebody had said were going to cause problems for their business constituents. It was called the Quality of Life Review. It was focused on EPA and OSHA regulations. I may have filed the first legal challenge to White House interference. In 1973, I had gotten a court-ordered schedule for EPA to issue some corrective rules under the Clean Air Act. And when the due date came for action in late '73 and EPA had not acted, I learned that they were stuck at OMB and as a part of the quality of life process. So the next morning, I filed show cause papers with the court, citing 2 OMB officials for contempt of court. 24 hours later, the rules were sent to the Federal Register. I tend to think that was my point of maximum effectiveness on dealing with the regulatory obstructionism. Tom does a wonderful job of documenting the gradual accretion of power to block and surround rules with red tape. I'll just mention in the Carter administration. By then, I was in the government at EPA, and we had hopes that under the Carter administration that that there'd be a retrenchment in this effort to kind of slow down government regulation. That didn't happen, and something called the Regulatory Analysis Review Group, RARG for effect, was set up, and I still think of it as a point of pride that in its first year of operation, the RARG process reviewed 5 rules government-wide, and 4 of them were mine. So I had a lot of time spent over at the White House trying to deal with folks who had been fed a line of stories about how bad these rules were. Tom spoke about the Gingrich Congress. That's another, I think, major historic point. And the thing that I like most about that experience was the coalition of labor, environmental, health, other progressive groups that came together. We worked really smoothly together. We worked really effectively together. And we basically, with the help of people like Phil's boss and many others, we blocked almost everything in the Contract on America. One notable exception is the Congressional Review Act, which did get enacted into law and is now being wielded as a major threat. And I can tell you it's having an influence every day on decision making in the administration. You know, how are we going to get a rule not only through the regulatory process, but how are we going to survive a CRA vote? What are we going to do about members of Congress who are up for re-election and they don't want to have this tough vote, and the opposition knows they don't want to have this tough vote? So this is a major tool that is being used. So let me just say a couple of words about moving forward. And I really like Tom's prescriptions. I think the missing narrative aspect is one of the strongest pieces in the book. We really have failed on our narrative. We have let the opposition define the government as an alien institution, and we haven't gotten across the fact that the government is what we, the people, use to protect ourselves. It's not an alien institution, it's our creation, and that message is one that we have to look for every opportunity to hammer home, because it's the place where they're playing to their advantage. And I think the message themes that Tom mentions, the economic and physical security, corporate responsibility, corporate accountability, and social costs are 4 very important message themes that we really should develop. Effective storytelling. Ronald Reagan knew how to use storytelling. We need to, sharpen our storytelling skills, and there certainly are, as Tom has documented, stories for each one of these themes. I also, would repeat, because repetition is a good thing, the action items that Tom has identified. Empower citizens, build a progressive idea infrastructure, build a progressive influence infrastructure. I'll mention one item that is worth noting, and I think it's one that I have some question marks about. The Obama campaign team has formed something called Organizing for Action. And it can be something that could be very helpful. But I think we in the progressive community also have to be somewhat leery of an operation that may decide that it's a good thing to be attacking the Republican Party, but not such a good thing to be putting pressure on the administration. So we're going to have to figure out how to work with that operation in a way that makes it useful to put pressure on government. The last comment I'll make is, when I was in government, I told my friends, do not leave me alone, by which I meant put pressure on me all the time, because people in government like to go to the middle, and the middle, if it isn't being defined by an active, progressive group, is going to be in the wrong place. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks. And Phil Barnett from the House Energy and Commerce Committee.
Thanks, Gary. It's great. It's really great to be here, to be with Tom and celebrating his book, which is, I agree with everything that David said. It's a great story of this historic battle between progressive forces trying to advance protection of the public and industry efforts trying to roll it back. And it's sort of battle after battle in this long running war. I've always thought of Tom as a brilliant legal scholar. I thought of him as a passionate advocate, a really nice person, but I never thought of him as a historian like this. I was thinking about the Michael and Jeff Scherer books of the Civil War, documenting all the battles. Well, he's the Michael and Jeff Scherer of the regulatory battles, and it should be mandatory reading. There's so many of the battles in here. I thought I would just talk a little bit more about Congress in recent years, and what happens on the regulatory side has a reflection in Congress. Maybe I differ a little bit with Tom about 2009 and 2010 and what happened there, because really, from my perspective, there was an extraordinary amount of legislation, positive legislation, that was achieved. And number one on the list would have to be health reform. That's something Congressman Waxman's been working for his entire career. Presidents and others have been trying to do that for decades, and that was achieved. But that wasn't all. From my boss, tobacco control was a huge priority for many years, and we finally got the bill to give FDA authority. We got the food safety bill thanks to Carolyn's efforts, and that was a big accomplishment. Dodd-Frank maybe had weaknesses, but that was still a good bill. And the stimulus bill had the Recovery Act had an extraordinary amount of money for good things. None of those were everything that I'm sure people in this room, certainly me, would have loved to have the public option in health care. It's terrible that the energy bill died in the Senate, the climate bill, and didn't pass. So there were certainly shortfalls, but there was, from my perspective, for the things that Congressman Waxman believes and people in this room believe in, there was a lot of forward movement then. It was a point when our forces were on the ascendancy and making progress. The absolute opposite happened the next Congress, as Tom talks about with the Tea Party that came in, and the Republicans, it was just so horrible last Congress, and there were 30 votes to try to repeal, everything was accomplished, tried to undermine, 30 votes to repeal the health reform, and then defund it, do oversight and everything. On the environmental side, it was so bad, we started to keep a database of the anti-environment votes. We had over 300 on the House floor. 1 out of every 5 votes was something to undermine the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, or open up areas for drilling. And my experience, and Tom talks about this, and if you go back to the Contract on America period, and then after that, the forces that Tom describes often tried to go after regulation a little bit indirectly. It was the paralysis by analysis, lots of different kind of reviews and hurdles, and make it just throw a lot of sand in the works. But this last Congress, it was almost like the blinders were ripped off, and there were some of those, we had bills like that too, but it was just direct assault. Let's allow coal plants to put more mercury in the atmosphere, and let's roll back this and that. So that's what we went through. We were asked to talk about the future, and is there any positive messages? Sometimes where I work in Congress, it's hard to be very positive these days about just look at guns, or we're going to do the FAA vote today. I guess that's good, but the whole thing was we didn't get any extra funding. We're living under this question. We're accepting. In terms of there's a lot that's negative, but I look and I can think of three messages just to say. One, when I look at the experience of the last two Congresses, there is a difference. Our side got a lot of laws that are enacted into law, and they need to be implemented. But those environment, none of which got enacted. Efforts to roll back the law. So that's one. Second, for where the public is, the election, I think it was one of the worst times possible to be an incumbent president running for re-election because the economy was so bad. And that was one of the problems that was really in 2009, 2010, trying to advance this agenda in a time of really bad economy and with a Republican Party that seemed just to want to make it as worse as it could. But even despite that, I think when the public looked at what the president's agenda was, which was the Republican and this anti-laissez faire thing, there was a rejection of it, and that's a good thing. And the last thing I would say is for this group is I think there's opportunities in the future. I don't look to Congress. We will try to do what we can. We'll try to stop bad things in the House. We'll try to be, creative where we can be. But to some extent, I think justifiably, the progressive community gave the administration, I know my boss did, something of a pass while he's running for re-election. Take climate, for instance. The president didn't want to talk about climate. It's such an important issue, but he had an electoral strategy. Well, now the administration is re-elected, and there's a lot of tools that the administration has to do a lot of good. And I know there's frustration, I'm sure, in this room about the OMB and the review process and how things were held up. Well, you could make a case maybe there was a political necessity to do that, but there's no political necessity now. And this community should really try to think creatively on the legal side, and then creatively on the advocacy side about how all can be done. A great example would be Dave's work on climate and on power plants. NRDC actually became like a mini EPA, and they went out and hired the same consultants that EPA would use when it figures out how to regulate power plants, and got an analysis that said, well, you can actually do something that gets great reductions from existing power plants, and it won't even cost that much, and these are the same analysis that you did. And that was a very kind of creative thing to do. It's given, on the environmental side, it's become a rallying point for action. I think that kind of thing can be a we're trying to do that also in the environmental area. We've set up a bicameral task force, Congressman Waxman Center at White House. We've written probably to a lot of you to get your ideas about how to move forward, and how do we take this opportunity. Now we should have an administration that's allied with us. There are all the forces that Tom says that are against, and we have to work through that.
Thanks, Phil. And last, Caroline Smith-DeWall of CSPI.
So the nice thing about going last is that I can agree with what everyone said. And Tom, I really enjoyed reading through your book yet, but it's, it's so nice to have a history that starts to explain a lot of what I've been seeing. I've been working on food safety issues for since 1991. It's a long time at this point. And what we have seen are regulatory agencies that have been really, really frozen. They're fractured. That's perhaps a historical accident, but they're definitely frozen in a move forward. We've also seen a huge number of outbreaks and recalls and events that have really shaken consumer confidence in food safety, and that was the driving force, I think, for adoption of FSMA. The thing that I want to comment on, though, is what I'm seeing right now. And what we're seeing right now is a OMB process, a White House process that is entirely willing to ignore statutory mandates, both substantive and deadline-oriented. So apparently, the OMB process in this Democratic White House has gotten so far ahead that they no longer need to comply with congressional laws that tell them that they have specific deadlines for accomplishing things, or that define, for example, the issue of very small business. I was just at a meeting with FDA where they were talking about how, you know, they want comment on whether very small businesses in the act are $1 million or less, and that's very small. It's like, but in the law we specifically put a number, and it's nowhere near $1 million. So I guess the lessons learned in the time that I've been doing this, and I worked with Gary and many others on the Act on America, still call it that. The thing I learned is the importance of real people coming in and talking about their experiences. Now, we saw that happen with the gun debate and vote last week, and we lost. The families were activated. There were families from Newtown. There were families from Virginia Tech, and we had we had a very modest proposal and 90% support publicly. Something's really gone awry, and that's what I really would hope that in this group we can come up with some normalcy and some strategies that will get us back to creating a more normal political climate, because what I'm seeing is it's almost a little frightening, and I don't want to overstate it, but the idea that a Democratic administration, which is the best we could hope for, basic consumer protections when we have a statute that defines what those are with specific deadlines, makes me really nervous. So maybe I'm ending on a difficult note, but I do want to just remind us that, you know, the voices of people outside of Washington are a powerful antidote, and one that we need to continue to use even after we lost that horrible vote last week. So, thanks.
Rather than just do the immediate Q&A, as I said at the beginning, I want to make sure everyone gets involved. Some of you have lived the battles that we've been talking about that go back many years, and the first head I see sticking out as I'm looking down is David Vladack. It's shining. Well, that's
only Gary can say that.
I have every right. David, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask for your reaction to some of these comments, and also pushing us forward, still keeping the ball perspective.
Thank you. I just want to reflect briefly on the three sort of themes that come out of going forward. One is we have lost the narrative battle, and the Tea Party phenomenon, this is sort of Carolyn's point, drove that home. I mean, you know, government isn't them, it is us. And we have not been able to make that point simply and eloquently. And unless we start turning the tide of this battle and portraying government as it should be portrayed, as a safety net, as an entity that can do what no other institution can in protecting us from air pollution or water pollution or from dirty foods or from fraud, we need to put a better face on government. We valorize one set of defenders. You know, after Boston, people hold the police in high regard. Well, the EPA is the climate police, is the water police, and you know, the Food Safety Inspection Service, for better or worse. You know, and I think we've not won that battle, and I think we need to do more. I think we also, you know, the one thing that Tom doesn't talk about is the success the founding funders have in changing the nature of the political game. I think part of the reason why Congress went over as far as it did and why we were going to have trouble in elections going forward is, you know, Citizens United and other decisions have given these founding funders even more clout today than they had before. and that is a disturbing issue as well. There are a lot of challenges. I think the frame of patch and repair is very helpful. As Phil points out, we've gotten some good things done, at least not in this Congress, in the prior Congress. And there are ways of reforming government quite substantially without congressional action. And we need, I was gratified to hear Phil say this. We need to hold this administration's feet to the fire for the next 4 years. There are lots of things it can get done, even in the face of a hostile Congress and even in the face of a hostile Supreme Court. And I think we need to use these next 4 years to really make some gains.
Other comments from people? I don't want to preclude questions, but I'd rather create a discussion and panelists can react also.
Well, I would just.
Say who you are also.
Randy Rabinowitz from the Center for Effective Government. I wanted to reiterate the point that David Hawkins made, which is, I think sometimes in friendly administrations, we go too easy on some of our friends who might be in government. And we have to help define the middle. And if we keep silent and don't vocally advocate difficult, we let the middle slip too far to the right.
Let me pose that back as somewhat of a question for everyone, including the panel here. Phil, you and David, you and Randy have now reinforced the notion that we should be pushing the Obama administration. They have won an election. Now's the time to, put forward actions. A lot of us have complained about centralized review. Many of you have read Cass Sunstein's new book, Simpler, where he, I hear the boos, okay? A lot of people have read it. Beryl Radin said she was screaming at the book as she read it. But it makes a strong case for centralized review. It makes a strong case for a centralized role that many of us have said have really been problematic for overriding agency expertise and a host of reasons. How do we operate, and Phil, maybe you want to be even the first since you were the one who suggested it. How do we deal with that when the White House is such a political animal? And how do we get OMB to move forward on a lot of these rules? Is it just pure public pressure? What do you think?
Well, I think you could look at the last 2 years, and you had a terrible election in 2010. You had the Republicans ascended. You had this economic message, and you could look. There was a political reasons not to regulate. There just, at least from where I sit, there was. And if you're that, you need an OMB process. They use the OMB process. One way to look at it, the OMB process was to help politically. To the extent that was what was happening, there was a rationale for it. But I think the point I was trying to make is that doesn't exist now. And now the question is that an empowered OMB that's going to be stopping things that now that has an opportunity to do? You don't need Congress to act. And so we're going to actually see the actions that should be done on the merits to protect food safety and implement that law, deal with issues like climate change, regulating the financial industry. Or is it going to be a continuation? And I think that would be very problematic. If it was a continuation where it's very difficult to act and things get bottled up. I agree completely with Randy's point. That's for the progressive community. That should really be thinking about how to put the appropriate pressure and to have and to insist that now there really is action, and these 4 years are really taken advantage of. The Congress is not going to be a great ally in doing things affirmatively, but I think Congress is also not going to be that effective for people who want to block these actions, because we're pretty gridlocked, and the president has vetoes. Then you're talking about 2/3 in the Senate, and it's going to be able to. It's not the Congressional Review Act should not be an excuse. Right. Now, there's no reason for the Congressional Review Act to be an excuse on these things. So I think that's one of the key issues to be focused on.
Dude?
Yeah,
others coming in.
I'll be quick. I just want to underscore a point that Phil made. The OMB review process is not the disease; it's a symptom. The disease is that even Democratic administrations, the White House just doesn't want to do the things that the progressive community is pushing it to do. And why is that? Well, I think it's all about campaign financing. You know, I mean, I witnessed this in the Carter administration, and you know, the job of the White House staff, as they define it, is to preserve the president's ability to maneuver. And if he is up for re-election, so far it's all been he, maximize the ability to avoid having to spend political capital that's going to make it more difficult to get re-election. And that's all tied into campaign finance. And I think we, as hard as it is, I think we have to be realistic and recognize that there is no person in America that can be elected to the presidency that is going to feel comfortable doing the things that we want him or her to do unless we change the campaign finance system. And so it's got to be a part of the agenda for all of us.
I've got Patricia, Catherine, Patrice.
Well, several of you have mentioned narrative, and I read someplace that people can't hold more than one idea in their minds at a time. But I think that we, as the progressive community, have to help connect the dots. What's going on? People can see the department, the FDA. They understand that, and they might understand OSHA or EPA. But nobody knows. You say OIRA, people's eyes glaze over. So that's one point, I think, is to tell the story about who is pulling the strings, who is the puppeteer, what are their motives, which then connects to David's point, because all the opinion research I've seen shows that the public is really very unhappy about the role of money in politics. So I think you could create a narrative that helps to connect the dots for people, and I think we have not done that very well.
I have Catherine. I would say who you are, since this is.
Catherine McVeigh, Center for Effective Development. David, I agree with you on the first term, but it's the second term.
Mm-hmm.
And the person that has been, I don't have a lot of hope. Maybe you're right, if David's right, that the OIRA director will be okay, but if the OMB director does not give me hope, does she give you hope?
No.
So the question, I think Tom talked about the idea that when we have someone who's supposed to be progressive president, we get good mid-rank people. So we have all of our friends go in and they're assistant secretary or somebody, but not the top.
Right.
And so unless you get the top leadership, they just shape the way what's possible within the agency. And do we have any kind of strategy about how we can do better, especially in a second term, when he doesn't have to get corporate campaign contributions again, about shaping how the choices get made for those top-level people?
Convince them that the politics of doing the things we want are good politics for them. That's what we need to do.
That ties exactly into what
Go ahead. Who are you?
I'm Patricia McGarity of opengovernment.org, and I think David, maybe somebody else raised the organizing for action thing. I think that undercuts everything we could hope for in terms of this president not being campaigning towards his next campaign, because he's out there taking all of his massive organizing capability and putting it in place, not for progressive causes, but for the party for the next election. And so I'm really not hopeful, not sanguine, that he will understand, or that his staff can understand, that he can take stances that don't have political implications. I mean, their first instinct was to allow big corporate funders to have much more direct access to the president than most other people. Their first instinct was secrecy. So I don't know. I would like to hear people up there say if they think that there's a way around that, and if that sort of does undercut our possibilities.
There's a case to be made, I think, for the proposition that the most important rule that's not quite pending yet, but could be pending, is the Securities and Exchange Commission's rule to make corporations say who they're
Yes.
giving their campaigns to.
Right.
And it may be that that's the kind of coalition that we need, is that people that have been fighting the environmental battles, the OSHA battles, and those battles should be saying, let's get behind that effort, because I think they'll find ways of circumventing it, but it still would be a very important in terms of corporate accountability,
Right.
to know
Good option.
whose campaigns they're
And it's
financing.
not subject to a review.
Yeah, that's true too. It is subject to cost-benefit analysis after. Yeah.
There are certainly, David, you and David Vladack, we all sat some years ago in Senator Levin, also a hero, many people in this room, sat in rooms with him, in a room with him multiple times, debating very nuanced elements around regulatory reform. Why is it that our heroes, not all, because we have Congressman Waxman, but why are many of our heroes not our leaders on these kind of regulatory issues? What's going on? Why we've got this? Is it simply the money in politics that you were raising, or is it something much different? There seems to be, for Senator Levin to have been the one that we are actually having to knock heads with, is rather very startling.
Well, he was running for re-election, and General Motors had this as a top priority, this legislation, and at least he was a good enough legislator to give us access to his office and listen to us. But we were always fighting an uphill battle because of the money.
Do you think it was?
Yeah, and the legislative veto. I mean, for Levin, I think part of this was the demise of the legislative veto. And trust on his part that regulatory agencies would go too far. And this gets back to David's point. The regulatory agencies he cared about were EPA and clean air rules and NHTSA with respect to the fuel economy. And so he wanted somebody, and if it couldn't be him, it should be at least someone in the White House to be more direct overseer of what the agencies were doing. That was what his stated rationale was, and he was pretty blunt about it.
Yeah, and that, by the way, is another dynamic that's operating against us, because we've got a change in this Congress, but historically, most members of Congress liked the idea of voting for clean air, clean water, and having a sweeping piece of legislation to EPA or to OSHA, go out and protect the public and stand up there with a big smile at the signing ceremony. And some of them welcomed the fact that there'd be a cop that was going to actually be in force secretly in a low-profile fashion in the White House that would actually prevent the agency from doing a lot of things that would annoy some of their other constituents. So they like this tension, and they like the low visibility opportunity to kind of defang the more sweeping activities that the regulatory agencies might take under these broad grants of authority from Congress.
Caroline, did you want to add to that about Champions Today even?
Well, I think we also, one observation, because I've only been doing this 25 years or so, but I mean, one huge change in the time that I've been looking at this is the issues around how media operates, and also the issues of real democracy, the rise in individual constituents being able, like regular people being able to access their members of Congress through the internet, through very direct, very simple means. So one thing we're really struggling with is, what does modern regulation look like, and how to promote that. Our regulatory system today, and I testified on this actually as part of, I think, this whole initiative, is frozen in time. And what that means is that science, new evidence in the climate area, for example, new evidence can't be taken in to the regulatory system there because they're operating on old rules they don't want to change the rules because the process of doing that's so arduous. So I'm just wondering, is there a way to tie together this immediate democracy and think through the concepts of regulation? You know, in my area, everyone likes inspection, but actually meat inspection is not controlling a lot of hazards we have. Well, what does new meat inspection look like, or what does a good regulatory program look like? But we need to be able to modernize, and it's just extraordinarily hard under this structure. And I just really worry. I mean, I have a fear of these regulatory standards becoming less and less relevant because the things like climate change are moving so rapidly, things like population growth, that, you know, the regulations actually aren't going to be that meaningful because the problems are going to be so much bigger.
Comments anyone have? If not, I want to just go back to the money and politics in a slightly different way. Before coming here, I pulled out a quote from over 100 years old, because I thought it was so relevant. Interstate Commerce Commission. Everyone in this room has done a little bit of reading of the history, remembers that Richard Olney came in the Grover Cleveland administration as a railroad lobbyist, a railroad lawyer supporter, and the ICC was set up as pretty much anti-railroad. And his friends asked him to kill it. And I pulled the quote that he responded to his friends and said, "The commission is or can be made of great use to the railroads. It satisfies the popular clamor for a government supervision of the railroads, at the same time that supervision is almost entirely nominal. Further, the older such a commission gets to be, the more inclined it will be found to take the business and railroad view of things. The part of wisdom is not to destroy the commission, but to utilize it." I'm just curious whether we're reliving history. What's
I
that?
said, that's cheery.
And
But,
then there's preemption to make sure that that's as far as anybody can go.
Well, I guess I'm asking, is history, are we living in the same vein as what Olney was prescribing? I mean, he was quite smart in his view from a business perspective.
You know, Gary, it does remind me that business has a very big stake in regulation. And the quote I like to pull out is the one where the biggest peanut manufacturer asked the Congress to see to regulation because the public was concerned about the health of processing peanuts. And he said in congressional testimony, we don't have the resources to inspect every plant, presumably making it, creating a public environment, confidence in the food supply. So there is, in principle, an alliance between enlightened business leaders and the kinds of regulatory issues that we champion. And I think we go into be thinking in those terms because the smart business leaders know that a regulatory system that satisfies the public, that it is protected, is good for business.
You know, lest we be too despairing, I just want to mention that, you know, some things have gotten better, and I think citizen empowerment is one of them. Government websites didn't exist when Bill Clinton took office. There weren't any. And now we have a tradition that I don't think any administration is going to be able to undo. And these things are incredibly empowering, especially if those of us who work in organized groups, you know, use our resources to make sure that average non-members are you know, aware of these tools and make use of them because they are very powerful, and that kind of infrastructure is something that we need to celebrate every time, every opportunity we can, because it is a very positive development.
Tom, did you want to say something on that?
No.
I just say, that was a very dire quote, but that's, I mean, that's not the situation. We have a lot of agencies that are under energy and commerce jurisdiction, and they're run by people that want to. David was at the FTC with, and John Liebowitz was the chairman there. They were trying to do good things. The FCC was trying to do good things. EPA under Lisa Jackson, if Gina McCarthy was there, HHS was Sebas, is not capture. So there are a lot of dire things that we're facing, but I don't think it's capture at the head of these most of these agencies right now, which is why we should have a lot of demands for these next 4 years, because people are going to be there that who will know better. They just have to make sure they do better.
I'll just comment that business has learned that you don't have to capture each of the individual agencies, you just have to capture the White House.
We've got Jim, Catherine, Rena. Anybody else? Okay.
Let's just on the let's not be too dire side, the quote that you mentioned, that I'm sure they didn't have open government, open meeting laws.
Right.
So that commission would not have been allowed to have people come in and document their proceedings.
They didn't have FOIA, they didn't have the Administrative Procedures Act, they didn't have the internet. These are all things that we can celebrate.
Hey, Jim Larger from AFR, Americans for Financial Reform. Sometimes these days you get a majority of the House and a filibuster strength contingent in the Senate taking a stand that is just hugely unpopular, hugely at odds with public opinion among Republicans, Democrats across the country, like their attacks on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I just wonder if, as an exercise, you all would think about what you do to translate overwhelming public opinion on something like that into any action in these particular couple of years that we are looking forward to.
You mean other than gun legislation that Caroline mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, gun legislation certainly came close, right?
Yeah.
Well, an accountability campaign is the obvious thing. You see something in advance and you go out and try to raise money to do effective accountability, and you get on radio shows and you get on the media markets where you can afford to make some buys, and you use the internet and basically try to get messages coming back into those members of Congress's offices saying, we hate what you did.
Others in the room want to respond to Jim?
I mean, one thing is to think, like, what is the NRA doing that's making it so powerful? I mean, what exactly, how have they so captured the psyche of these members? I know it's the A+ rating, but I mean, I remember meetings going back 3 election cycles where basically we were told within the Washington community, do not mention guns, guns are off the table. And so, I mean, it's just, maybe we can learn something from the opposition, I don't know, but I agree, there's a struggle. We need to capture the momentum and the messaging and maybe organize in a different way to do that.
Maybe it's because I work in sometimes places seem so hopeless, but people think I just look too much on the bright side of things sometimes. But it's a defense mechanism. But in my experience, things can go in cycles, and when the economy is bad, it's really hard to get a message out there. When the Republicans, never any committee proceeding, but brought votes on the floor to gut the heart out of the Clean Air Act by repealing the health-based standards. That's wildly unpopular. Everything they did was wildly unpopular. But it was very difficult for people to understand it because the economy was bad. And the economy is starting to pick up. And as the economy starts to pick up, people care about these other values, and there's more space for them. So guns are a little bit unique. Maybe that's like the abortion issue. There's an intensity. Abortion is a different issue, but I don't think there's much of a corporate thing with guns as it is this fanatical element that's there. But there's going to be, I think, more space for a good message as the economy picks up.
Rena Steinzer?
I wanted to agree with the said that capture is, I don't think really is the issue with a lot of these agencies, perhaps with some of them, but most of them, no. I think that one of the things that we haven't mentioned so far is money. There was a very startling figure in a story about West Texas that showed the amount of money that the state had made available to emergency response, because that was the problem there, and the line was heading downward at a very sharp angle. And I think people need to understand that you get what you pay for. They intuitively know this about everything that they do. And there is just simply no way, for example, that the FDA can, without gutting other parts of its mission, take after compounding pharmacies, which have killed 45 people in the last 6 months. And there's no way that they can really implement food safety, given the sequesters, the lack of inspectors, the front page story in the Post about the guy whose lungs bled out because all our chickens are being sprayed with chlorine because we're taking inspectors off the line. That whole episode saves pitifully $13 million a year, which we shouldn't even be wasting breath on that kind of money. So I wish, and this has been something I've wished for a long time, and hope that we can renew our effort to convince our founding funders of the importance of doing the very difficult budgetary tracking work. They don't make it easy. The budget is, I've spent more time than I even care to admit trying to trace from year to year what the agencies are getting and how much they have left. But that's certainly from an inspection point of view, I think it's critical.
So let me ask all of you, hearing both the downs and the ups we've talked about, what would be the top level change you would try to push for to make the regulatory protection system better? What's out of all the things we've started to talk about here, what's top on your list? And whether it's dreaming or whether it's real, let's push the envelope a bit and think about that. And I'd love to hear from each of you, and including the panelists, what's sort of the top level item you have. Maybe you want to take a crack at that? David, you started it by picking up on the discussion that several of the panelists had about narrative. I don't know if that's your top level one, though.
I vacillate between that, because I really do think that unless we do a better job persuading the American people that what government does is important, we're always going to be trying to have finance or campaign finance. I really, Dave Hawkins has many times in the last hour, used an illustration of someone like Carl Levin, who's a good guy and wants to do the right thing, but he's got to go home, and GM is just a powerful force there. So I'm not sure I can pick between the two, but I come back to the narrative, because I think that even with campaign finance reform put aside, we need to do a better job persuading the American people that what government does is important. And I think they know it intuitively. They just don't put a name on it. I mean, they trust their food to be safe. We have better cars than we ever had before. We've made strides, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. But they don't think of government as helping provide that. They just take it for granted. And they take it for granted in part because we haven't made the case to them that but for the government, they would have to worry about those sorts of things. And so I do think the narrative is an important thing, though I worry desperately, too, about campaign finance. I do think that with Citizens United and the amount of money, personal donations in the last election cycle were enormous. And this is exactly the group of founding funders that Tom spent so much time talking about.
Ross Eisenberg is sitting behind. Did you want to come up with one?
Well, you know, there are easy things, it seems, that don't get done. When you have people in China, when you have the Chinese government, you know, essentially shutting down economic activity in the city for a week at a time because people are choking to death on the bad air. That's an opportunity for us to go to, you know, whatever sources we have, Rachel Maddow, NPR, the newspapers, and get them to say, why isn't that happening here? We have the Clean Air Act. You know, it could be happening when you have this disaster in Bangladesh in November, and the one, you know, a few days ago. To have people say, why isn't that happening here? I mean, West Texas, it was terrible, but it wasn't 300 plus people dying in a single event. You know, we should be saying it doesn't happen here because we have tort law and we have, you know, all these protections for people. And, you know, it ought to be a chorus that just rises up when this stuff happens. And it's not happening.
It does seem that storytelling fits right next to David's narratives, too. They go hand in hand.
That's the narrative he's talking about. The government really does make a difference, and you can see when government isn't there, that the disasters are, you know, become thick.
I think I worked for a long time for a common cause, so I absolutely understand the problem of money in politics. However, with Mr. Levin, it was also that auto workers were in the statement, and plants are in the states. And you know, when you talk about the device industry, those are jobs in Minnesota, 40,000 jobs, which is a lot to Senator Klobuchar and Al Franken. So I think we have to sort of look at that. I also think I think Carolyn mentioned about the media, and I think that's a huge piece of this. Your storytelling abilities can be absolutely wonderful, and I do think that the coalition, and I think if we really want to get the story out, we have to train the reporters. We have to feed them. We have to give them training sessions. They'll come if you pave their way and feed them, and you have them in a nice place, because that's what major conservative think tanks do. And you know, also foundations on the left, and well, the progressive foundations, I shouldn't say that, you know, should really have long-term commitments to think tanks. You know, so that you get real, solid, consistent work that pays off in 20 years. It's not gonna, I mean, they planted the seeds, 30, 40 years ago about small government. It didn't happen overnight.
Right.
And, you know, married to someone who ran a wonderful little nonprofit for 10 years, and then he had to fold because it didn't get the foundation support it needed. It just seems that progressive foundations aren't committed to the long term enough. I also would think that we have to think about doing stuff at the state and local level. I think the states are the laboratories.
I'm going to give prerogative to Caroline, then come back to you.
Okay, and I'm just, because I want to hear your comment. The narrative issue, I think the issue with campaign finance reform, it's very palpable, and I always want to put that at the top of the list. But in fact, it's really the businesses within the district that have the most influence. So I'm not sure that's the winning strategy. The narrative issue, I think, is critically important, but our target isn't just media. At this point, our target is this blogosphere, it's this direct democracy. We have to figure out the right targets, but we can't. Media is still old strategy, and the new strategy is really one that's very, very direct, and we've got to be better at that than the other side.
And when I say media, I do mean the blogosphere, so you're absolutely right to point that.
All forms of reaching the public.
Absolutely.
And I would
Patricia.
add on to that, saying that Patricia McGarity and the government need to think much more creatively. Every day when I ride home on the red line toward Silver Spring, it keeps getting obscured, but there's a mural that says, labor, the folks who brought you the weekend.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, I think we need to think of murals. I think we need to think of competitions of YouTube videos and something that's really creative that gets the message out to a much more general public. No offense, but we have tort reform or not tort reform, does it with most of the public. It's like, what is that? It's not going to, it's important, but it's not going to reverberate with the public. I think you have to think really creatively if you really want to generate this new democracy, use the new engines of engagement. And I think there's a lot of people who, are very interested.
I will say that in the past fights, especially going back in the Gingrich battles, our strength was in telling personal stories, not in the stories about China versus here or the law that we have to protect us. It was the person who talked about asthma or talked about their kids who got food poisoning, or the list goes on, and then we drew out the policy issues. And those are, tough in light of what you two were talking about penetrating the media, broadly media. It's hard to do that, but it certainly is powerful.
I think Rena is right, that there's a good story to be told about the mismatch between the obligations of regulatory agencies, people's expectations about what those agencies will do, and the modest amounts of money and people that are assigned to those things. I think that's a very powerful story. Everyone understands. I think that you just can't look at all these plans with this tiny workforce, and only made worse by sequestration, budget cuts, and so on. But if I could say another thing.
You only get one.
I think we, in the long run, we need to get on the side of regulatory simplification. Even if somebody of controversial nature has written a book. Because ultimately, people obey laws when they incorporate them into their own sense of behavior and what's right. And a really big problem of getting regulatory compliance is people's misunderstanding of the law, the complexity of law, or their annoyance with the law because it doesn't work. In the agricultural sector where I know something, it's just, you don't get compliance, not because people don't want to comply, but because it seems too daunting to do it under certain circumstances.
I've got Randy, and then I'm going to go all the way back to Gary Kelman back there, and Sue Rob Weissman, and so everyone's going to speak up. Trust me.
I was going to come back to something Carolyn said about some of the laws being really obsolete, and we really need to think about whether they're modern enough, because if the narrative is about how government can protect you, the explosion in West Texas, I can tell you, OSHA is not going to ever get to all those fertilizer plants, ever in our lifetime. And so creating some expectation that OSHA's there to protect you from fertilizer explosions is just going to feed a negative frame until there's some kind of regulatory regime where there's some hope that they actually have the resources or the ability to do something about situations like that. Then I'm not sure creating a narrative that governments can take care of it necessarily helps. Next time there's going to be explosion, OSHA's more likely than not going to be nowhere near there.
Sure. Gary Kelman, Center for Responsible Lending. I had a smile about regulatory simplicity. Of course, for all of us that work on this stuff, right, we all know that, in fact, a huge reason that some of the regulations are so complex is because industry lobbies to make sure that they are complex, and then they complain about the fact that they're 800 pages long. So just sort of a little irony there. The one thing I guess I would touch back on is some of the challenges. I think that the coalition has done a really good job at identifying very specific things. Right? We don't want to be arguing or talking in their narrative, which is about regulation. Right? We're always about, well, actually, it's about clean air, or it's about safe bank accounts, or it's about various specific things that people go, yes, agree with that, and I support that. And to me, this is the biggest challenge, is every time we do that, and if you go out to the public and they go, oh yeah, of course, I support clean air, but I hate government. I support, making sure that the banks can't screw me, but, so that seems good, but the rest of it is all bad. And so we're playing on a field where they have controlled that government is bad, even though each of these, as we know, all the polls show that on any one of our issues, the public is widely supportive. And so the question that I find the hardest to crack is, how do we get people to connect the different dots so they see it? If we could get them to see that it is actually connected and it is part of a broader effort around public health and safety, then we can win. I just don't know that we've been able to break through that, and to me that is the challenge that we have to overcome. If we get people to, it's funny, people, right, we also hear that the right and conservatives go, you should leave it all to private charity, right? That's the other favorite thing, right? But for the Katrina stuff, I thought was very telling. Red Cross raised in the first, month or so, $500 million online. That's a huge amount of money, $500 million. The first allocation from Congress was $20 billion. When we act collectively, obviously we can do much more. And so how do we get that narrative that acting collectively is going to protect the public health and safety better? And I find that to be the biggest challenge, and if we could change that, we'd get some.
We're going to put you in charge of that.
Yeah.
I don't think I'll being me, I'll challenge the premise of your question. I don't think there's certainly no one thing.
You get 5.
I'll do whatever I feel like. Give me the floor. There's a lot of interesting things that came out of it. I think, for sure the campaign finance stuff. I think on Gary's point, I agree except sort of, which is we get one. I'm kind of despairing, but not in the way we were despairing right now, because actually, not just that people don't agree with us just on clean air, we don't do so bad even on the generic questions. We think we do so bad because we do so bad in DC. But even on the generic questions in the polling, it's not so bad. The big challenge is how come that we do okay on the generic stuff and great on the specific stuff that we can't translate it into anything. And that's we know what the answers are. But the solutions aren't so obvious. I think on the narrative piece, I agree with all this stuff. I think that everybody's been commenting on. But again, I think we're overselling how bad we're doing on the narrative. I think we don't have the intensity that we want from people. For me, a lot of the aggressive forward narrative for us has to focus on the perpetrators, not just sort of telling the good story, but really focusing on the perpetrators and talking about corporate criminality as corporate crime and corporate wrongdoing. And I think we need legislative and regulatory pieces that address that per se. So I think there's a lot, and the coalition is hopefully soon going to start doing a lot of work on this. So I think there's a lot to be done in that piece. In terms of sort of bigger structural sort of regulatory approaches, I think I'm sorry I missed the discussion, but the citizen empowerment thing, we need new things, but we need a lot of old ideas to be the citizen empowerment stuff is for sure a big piece. I think the precautionary principles of framework is a huge thing for us, even though we don't have languaging still on that, I don't think. And that's I think, an important challenge, because I don't think that's right. And on the simplicity thing, that's kind of interesting. Barry Commoner had talked about different kinds of regulatory standards, and sort of rather than calibrating, just going to 0, right? Bands were better than kind of potentially gamed levels of toxics or whatever. And that's you can think about that as a simplicity thing, and the same kind of stuff you can think about in the financial sector, rather than talking about capital standards or incredibly complex systems for looking at how financial institutions are organized, just talking about breaking them up clean, simple. I think those kind of simplicity things are right, and they do better, they're easier to explain. They have more public, so you're not confusing the public, and they actually are more either enforceable or self-enforcing. So I think those are a few of the pieces that I would throw out. I'm not sure how many I got there here.
Just another thought on the design and simplicity, and I agree completely that we have not paid as much attention to simplicity as we should, because that is the pathway to citizen awareness. But rules sort of have 3 attributes that we'd like. We'd like them to be simple, we'd like them to be rigorous, and we'd like them to be flexible. But, you know, my theory is that you can only maximize 2 of those at the expense of the third. So the commandment, thou shalt not kill, is simple and rigorous, but is not very flexible. You could have the IRS version of that, which would be, you know, for taxpayer entities subject to Part 17, except as provided in Section 37, the following acts are prohibited. And then you could have the Heritage Foundation version, which is try not to kill. So, you know, you can't get all 3. And the challenge is writing rules where you try to get the right mix.
Anybody else, we're winding down, anybody else who has not spoken that would like to throw out something? The only one that, and Rob, you sort of touched on it, that hasn't really come out is, for me, one of the top items, beyond the ones we even said, is just much greater enforcement, even of the rules that are in place. You talked about it in a more extreme way, but you know, whether it's criminalizing but I think that this notion of these penalties are just the cost of doing business today is just ridiculous.
OSHA's $7,000 serious penalty was set in 1990, so it's worth about half that now, and it was too low when it was set in the 1990s.
Well, and it also just ticks me off, frankly, where I see, you know, West Fertilizer, you know, DOT gives a $10,000 fine, and then they talk it through, and it comes down to basically $5,000. I mean, it's just a silly game that isn't real, and there's no penalty.
So we could go after that with, you know, with messages aimed at, you know, average people, which says, you know, if you're caught speeding X miles over a speed limit, you know, even if nobody is hurt, that because you're putting society at risk, you're going to be hammered with, and if it happens again, you're going to lose your license. So why do we let these operators of inherently dangerous facilities get off with, you know, a brush, you know, and just bring it home, you know, rather than talk about it in the abstract, put it in the context where you could really get people pissed off.
Hey, I want to thank everyone for coming out on a Friday afternoon, and what I started with that little story about Einstein to find his ticket, and I think we're going to go down a journey, all of us together, to find the ticket, and I'm really pleased to have Professor McGarity lead he can be our conductor. How's that? And I think we should give everyone a round of applause. I also want to thank the co-hosts again of CSS, CEG, and CPR, and thank you all. Thanks for coming.